In today's episode of How to Get That Look, I'm gonna go after the very famous film style and show you how to achieve it, and I'm gonna take the TV show Fargo as a reference and really go through that look and show you a few screenshots and really discuss what the essence of it is and what the characteristics are, because even though I'm gonna show the actual editing afterwards on a picture in Lightroom, if you're a videographer and you wanna do that for a video, then you can pretty much just copy all of these settings over to Premiere, because these two programs have very similar color editing tools. But even if you're using another program such as DaVinci Resolve or Final Cut or Sony Vegas, or maybe on the photography side Photoshop or GIMP, you're still gonna be able to get that look, because I'm gonna talk about the essentials of it and how to achieve that. Alright, so after this very long intro, let's get into the actual screenshots, and especially this one right here from the first season of Fargo, and I kinda wanna go over you with what the characteristics are. So let's actually make a list here and just list all of these things, because then you're gonna be able to replicate that very easily in pretty much any program. So first thing that you can definitely notice here is that it looks very desaturated. And this seems to be a general theme with pretty much all of the film looks. Now there's a wide variation of the film looks, but minus saturation is definitely a very big part of them, especially here in this Fargo specific look that I'm going after. Then the next characteristic is that you definitely have a lot of shadow detail. Everything looks rather flat within the shadows, but at the same time, what is very important is that you still have some of the very dark shadows, for example within the cubby holes right here, or for example the fridge handle right there. They are still really dark and they are not washed out and they are not flat. So it's important to raise the shadows, but at the same time keep the very dark shadows still dark. The third thing is the low contrast. Additionally to the low amount of saturation and the very bright shadows, relatively speaking, you have a very kind of washed out picture, and that is something that you can achieve with minus contrast. Then as a fourth essence, you have the greenish tonalities and the greenish cast. This is definitely a thing that you have a lot in the old school movies and TV shows and whatever, but especially here in Fargo that kind of goes for that old school look. You have it constantly throughout, and they even mix that with some warmer shadows sometimes to make it even older looking, but that's really a thing for itself. But you know, generally speaking, the most important thing here is definitely the greenish tint. As a fifth characteristic, you have the noise and the grain. Now this is very obvious, you see it a lot in films, so this is also a very important and very essential part of this look. Then as number 6, I've actually got something that is very selective and that isn't really used all the time, and that is a very bright highlight, and especially sky or wherever the light is coming from. So for example, if you look at this picture, you can definitely see that the snow as well as the sky is very bright, and that there's absolutely no attention on these two things. They are just kind of negative space, and they are there, they do their job, but they don't really have any texture or any detail in them. Same if you go to the next picture right here, you can see that the windows are very faint, very bright, and you can't see outside. Now this is of course a thing that you might want to do or consider to get more attention on the actual things that are dark or in the foreground, but I'm just gonna put it as number 6 because it's a thing that is very selective and at the end is not something that is absolutely necessary for this look. And that is actually pretty much it. Now, very specific to Fargo itself, you have a very coolish look with a lot of blues additional to the greens, and this is of course because it's a winter show, there's a lot of snow, it really brings across the cold and the harshness and the bareness, but I really don't think that this is absolutely necessary for the look at all. This is just kind of the very characteristic of Fargo, especially when being outside. So now I'm here in Lightroom with an unedited picture to actually try all of these 6 steps out and really see if that's all there is to it. And once again, whether it be a picture or video, it doesn't really matter. Also, if you have a different editing software, then you're just gonna be able to use the same kind of adjustments with the respective tools. Quickly though, before I get started with step 1, I'm just gonna crop the picture, do something that looks a little bit more cinematic. This is of course a thing that is pretty much mostly present in modern films, and is absolutely not essential for the overall style and look and editing of the picture or the video, so it's just kind of an extra. So then to number 1 is minus saturation, and that is easy enough, just bringing down saturation right here. I would suggest you to not go too far because you don't want to make it look black and white, but at the end of course it's just up to you how much you really want to go there. Then the second thing on the list is bringing up the shadows, easy enough done right here, but at the same time keeping the very dark shadows and the very dark blacks still black. For example, here in this window you have it a little bit, then you also have it right here and maybe the tires on the car. So you can do that and make just these things a little bit darker by bringing down the blacks within Lightroom. And you really have to watch out and make sure you don't go too far, otherwise you can really make it too contrasty, which is also not something you want to do. And specifically, once again, if you're in Lightroom, you can go to the tonal curve and just go to the shadows here and actually bring them down, because they will just affect the very dark shadows, whereas the shadow slider here in the basic adjustments will just kind of affect the overall and very broad kind of darkish and shadow areas. And actually, as an additional thing that I've mentioned, additionally to bringing up the shadows, is also to make the overall picture relatively flat looking. So I'm actually also going to bring down the highlights. I didn't write that down, but I think it's fairly good to also have quite a lot of highlight detail, at least for the start now. At the end you can always go to number 6 and then still increase the bright highlights and make them brighter. But I would do that with other tools, for example the whites and the highlight slider down here. We're gonna get to that a little bit later on, but point being is that 2 is really about bringing up the shadows while still keeping some of these very dark shadows dark, but then additionally to that also make the whole picture relatively flat and kind of low contrast, because that's very, very important. Then number 3 is low contrast, and this is fairly obvious. We've already done that pretty much with step 2 by bringing up the shadows and down the highlights, but you can go even further by bringing down the contrast slider right here. And how far you want to go is definitely up to you. You can bring it 50 down, maybe even 100, and you could even grab an adjustment brush with some more minus contrast and even brush over some areas, or perhaps the entire picture if you really want to. But I think about minus 100 contrast is really enough and works quite well here. Then to number 4, the greenish tint. For that I'm just gonna go into the split toning, go to the highlights and just add some greens there. And actually I don't want to just add very greenish greens, I want to mix them with a little bit of this coolish color, because I just think it works better for the overall film look. But at the end it's definitely preference whether you like this kind of look or maybe a more greenish green. But most importantly, once you've figured out your actual hue that you want, is to bring down the saturation to a level that is actually feasible and doesn't look like, I don't know, whatever this looks like, but you just want to keep it still a little bit natural. You don't want to go too far. So I think about maybe 25, maybe even 30 works pretty well here. And this already looks a lot more cinematic, especially if you compare from before to after, really a huge difference. And down here with the shadows, by the way, your program might not call it split toning, but there's pretty much an equivalent for both of these things in any program really. So just have to find it. And down here in the shadows, this does the exact same thing as with the highlights, just with the shadow parts of course. And here it's actually a little bit tricky. For example, if you look at this screenshot right here, you can see that they've used quite a warm color. Now this might be for aesthetics reasons, but it also looks a little bit more oldish, so it's really up to you whether you want to use that. Because in some other screenshots they haven't done that, they've kept it relatively neutral, or maybe even added some blues, and this is actually a good combination, whether you want to go for this typical cold Fargo look of winter or not. It is kind of a good idea to mix some shadow blues, in my opinion, with definitely some highlight greens. So here's before any split toning, here's after. It's quite a big difference, and once again you can always fine tune all of these hues and amounts, so it really looks not over the top, but rather just does what you want it to do. So then number 5 is the noise and grain, and we're nearing the end. It's really not much more to be done. And noise and grain is very important for this old film look, and there are obviously multiple ways you can achieve that. First one in Lightroom, the obvious one would just be to add grain, and you can absolutely do that. However, I would suggest you not to add too much. For example, right here, it really looks completely terrible and not natural at all. So you just want to add a little bit, so you don't even notice that there is any grain necessarily, but it rather just looks more film and vintage-like. So you can also zoom in and of course fine-tune all of that. Then another option that you can actually use to get this kind of grainy overall look is just to add a ton of sharpening. And this will make your picture very sharp, which might be a look that you want to go for, but it also might not be what you want, and you'd rather have a little bit of a softer overall look because it looks older and it's just kind of a different style and feel to it. So it's very much up to you whether you want to add a lot of that or just nothing at all. But if you do decide to add any sharpening, even if you want to have 150, you definitely do not want to bring the mask into the right. Usually in all of my pictures I do that, but this will just take away some of that noise from the non-textured surfaces, which in exchange gets rid of a lot of the noise and, you know, this very texture that you have from the sharpening, as you can see here while I'm zoomed in. And of course, always you can also go just about 70 maybe, and you don't really have to go all the way. But I think maybe I'm actually going to add a little bit, but definitely not too much, because I don't want to make this super sharp. I do think that this gets rid a little bit of this overall look and vintage style, but it's just an option that you might want to consider. But definitely a little bit of grain works really, really well. Then for number 6 is the bright highlights. Once again, this is just kind of an optional thing that you can do. For example, in these screenshots they were used, but in these other ones it wasn't really utilized. So it's definitely up to you whether you want to use that or not. But in case you do, then you can do that with a couple of things. One would be the tonal curve, just the highlights right here, and bring that up. That makes the very bright highlights a lot brighter. You can also bring up the whites, however, this will also affect, as you can see with the extreme example here, everything in the foreground and the windows, so it might not really be what you want, unless you really want a more dynamic picture. And dynamic is usually good, but in this kind of film look, especially if you have an overcast picture, it might not actually work in your favor because it makes it look too interesting and too good, where you really would want a more gloomy and maybe a more kind of flat and just more depressing overall mood. So that's definitely something to consider, but there are a lot of sliders and a lot of programs that you can do that with. Probably the best thing is just to add a local adjustment such as a graduated filter here and just add a lot of bright highlights in the sky that way. Or if you want to do it even more specifically, then you can just grab an adjustment brush and really make sure that you only have the sky selected. But I mean, the bright highlights, I'm not really sure if that really works. It does change the mood quite a bit, and once again, it's not absolutely essential for this type of look. So I think I'm actually just gonna leave that out and just bring up the highlights here and make the very bright highlights a bit brighter to make the sky and really just the sky more interesting, but keep the foreground relatively flat and not make that one too dynamic. And as a 7th point that is really mainly very specific to Fargo is of course the bluish look, because it was shot in winter and with all of this bareness and the cold, it really brings it across very good. But it is not necessarily necessary, so it's very much up to you whether you want to do that. And maybe I'm actually gonna make this overall picture just a little bit colder anyways, but I don't think I want to go that far as they've done with some of these pictures or some of these scenes in Fargo, the TV show. And with that said, that is pretty much it. We've already got the film look. If we see from before here, I mean, this is unedited, of course. If I would edit this into another style, I would do some other adjustments to it. But you can really see the resemblance from this kind of picture to one that is, for example, used here in Fargo, just a screenshot. And it's very, very easy to achieve this look. It's really nothing crazy about it. There are just pretty much 6 simple steps to it. And the thing that is very important at the end of any editing, whether it be a picture or the overall color style for a video or a film, is just to refine everything. For example, here, you could go even more into the minus blacks to really refine everything even more. You could also go into the HSL tool, and this is, by the way, a thing that you can kind of make artificially. For example, here in this screenshot, you can see that the mark is really red compared to the rest of the picture, which is quite desaturated. So for example, you can mimic that by just going into the HSL tool, grabbing this little saturation slider, and for example go over the reds right here and bring them up. And then at the same time, let's say you want special attention on this car, this blue car, then you could also bring up this saturation right here. And that way you just create additional attention on certain parts of the picture while keeping the overall style relatively desaturated. And if that particular style is all that you're interested in, then you can end the video right now. Thank you very much for watching, by the way. But I'm gonna go on to another picture and edit it a little bit differently with kind of the same ideas in mind, just with a picture that I've already previously edited into something that is very contrasty and very vibrant, and then just kind of adjust it from there, which kind of creates a different look. So if you're interested in that, you can just stick around. And I've actually got sent a few pictures from another person that was really interested in a look from a particular Instagram photographer right here. And this picture right there is very, very close and very similar to the one that I showed you previously. It's pretty much just a Fargo style, really, with the greenish tint, low amount of overall saturation, relatively bright shadows, while still the very dark shadows being dark, and of course the low contrast. But there is actually another picture from that one photographer, this one right here, and this is actually very similar to that Fargo look. And the only thing that is really different is that it is much more contrasty, and at the same time the greenish look is kind of gone. So this is also what I would describe, I mean, this is a very popular look, especially in photography as well, maybe not so much in film, but here, what I would call this is kind of the matte book look. And these kind of pictures always remind me of this look that you have when you print a picture in a book, or that you see in a book, and that has kind of a matte texture to it. But it is very, I mean, I'm sure you've seen it somewhere. It's very, very distinctive, and of course it might be quite interesting to some to get this kind of look on a screen. So what I'm actually gonna do is just take this picture right here that I've edited before and kind of turn it into something like that. If we take this picture as a reference, once again, just the major difference is not having this greenish tint, so I'm just gonna reset the greenish tint, and resetting it or turning it into pretty much a warmish tint. So I'm gonna go here into highlights, add a little bit of warms, and also go into the shadows and also add some warm tones, maybe even a bit more towards the actual reds, and just fine tune that. And the major difference as well is just to have a relatively contrasty picture, but it's not the kind of contrast that you can get with the contrast slider right here. So I would suggest you to keep that in the minus, but rather go farther with the minus blacks and really get that look that way. Also, you could bring up the color temperature and just make it even more kind of seem like that. And here you can also see some differentiation. For example, this white wall isn't particularly warm. So for example, here you could take an adjustment brush, maybe just add a little bit of blues with a pretty big brush actually, and then just brush over some areas to get some differentiation there. Perhaps the sky wasn't the best idea, so let's remove that right here and rather just add maybe a little bit of blues right here and there. So you do have some differentiation and it doesn't look so overall very boringly warm. But this is pretty much the overall look. Maybe he in this picture has used even more grain. That's definitely something you can do, and once again you can also add a lot of sharpening and get a very similar look, just a very sharp one that way. And since this video is already so long, I just thought I'm gonna take another picture that was actually previously already edited. As you can see here, it's fairly contrasty, very vibrant, dark shadows and so on. And just try to turn it not necessarily in kind of a film and Fargo look, but much more into this kind of matte paper look. So what I'm gonna do here is have this once again fully edited picture with all of the sliders already moved, but I'm just gonna go into the minus contrast like crazy, and that already makes it look very close to this kind of paper look. But then I'm also gonna go down here and add some more grain, and that should really seal the deal and make it really look like it printed on a paper, on one of these matte and non-glossy papers. And this is really close. This is very simple, and of course you might have to fine tune with some other of the shadows and the tint and so on. But here, I actually think that works quite well. It's still very vibrant and still very contrasty overall, especially with the dark shadows. But it definitely looks very different to what I've had previously right here. I really like both pictures a lot, but this is just the kind of look that you might want to go for. So you know, that's also why I wanted to kind of keep these two things separate from the Fargo and film look to this kind of matte paper look, this texturized paper look. Because here you can really have an already pre-edited picture that is very saturated, very vibrant, and just do a few very small adjustments to it to get that paper look. But with the film look, you would really have to take something from scratch and make sure you have the tint, and you have the contrast, and the shadows, and the overall noise, and so on, and that you don't have it too saturated and too contrasty already. So that was it for this video though, and I hope you find it interesting and helpful. I think I'm gonna continue with this kind of how to get a style editing video format, because I think it's quite interesting. Also, a thing that I've thought about is to make a show or a separate episode format thing where I just kind of talk about a TV show or maybe a movie and go over some of the characteristics of the style, but also how they use it and what kind of the characteristics are. Now, this is really just an idea, and I'm not quite sure if I would even be able to do that because of copyright and so on. I'm actually already scared to show these Fargo screenshots, but I'm definitely gonna make sure that these screenshots are obviously within fair use, so that if YouTube decides to flag my video as copyright infringement, which YouTube is very known to do quite a lot of times, that I can actually appeal the whole process and don't get a strike on my channel. So that was really it for this video. Thank you very much for watching, thank you very much for sticking around so long. I really enjoy making these videos because my kind of style is very vibrant, very contrasty, so it can be really refreshing and interesting to see how to achieve kind of a different style. And there are always certain things that you can take from something, even though your style yourself might be completely different. Anyways, that was it. Thank you once again, and take care.